That sounds like it's a really difficult job to manage obsolescence. How on earth, Tim, do we find what's going obsolete? How do we manage the whole thing? Because there are in any element, in any like the rovers on Mars at the minute, in David's space example, and just generally back to maybe in defence, like a battleship, for example, which has literally millions and millions of parts. How on earth do we define an item going obsolete? How does that process? How is that managed internally?
Well, we have a number of tools available to help us manage these sort of programs. Now, technically, the biggest risk of obsolescence sits around the electronics world, and the electronics world have a number of really good support tools that allow you to do prediction and assessment of obsolescence. We're fortunate in Alan Webb, we have our Diamond OM tool that allows us to do this. So although obsolescence in electronics, electromechanical items is probably the biggest risk, it's probably the one that it is the one where we have more information to enable us to manage that sort of process. Going beyond that, we're starting to see much greater vulnerability to software obsolescence. And we've been involved in a number of software programs looking at the obsolescence, predicting the life cycles, using roadmaps, working with the developers, and also looking at third-party provision of data as well. So if you look at the actual pure items, that's where most of it sits. We shouldn't discount mechanical, but there are issues around mechanical, but they tend to be handled on a one-to-one basis. Now, if you look at the availability and discard availability, then you start to look at what happens with legislation. Then there's a whole raft of different things that come into place. We're all pretty familiar with ROSH, with restriction of hazardous substances, that came out in 2006, which listed 6 chemicals that are considered harmful to the individual. This is now somewhere up to about, I think, 13 in the latest release of ROSH. And then following on from that, we had REACH. That is basically a large impact on substances of very high concern that now affect a huge amount of programs based on the manufacturer's use of these chemicals. And that manufacturer could be yourself in a process, or it could be who make equipment items that go into your equipment. The third one that comes into this area of legislation in terms of chemicals is called POP. This is pollutants, persistent organic pollutants, and this is legislation aimed at stopping a number of, again, substances of very high concern entering into the food chain. Now, that might seem quite obscure to industry, but of course, when we use those sort of pollutants, then it actually does go, we have to dispose of them or have to be recycled in some way. So there's legislation looking at these harmful chemicals that stop it getting into the food chain. And then we can move on from that in terms of commercial legislation. And ITAR is one that is certainly outside of America, we have to be very cognizant of. If we're using items that are ITAR registration in the US, then we have to, as in organizations, we have to track where those items are used. Even if our equipment is sold from one country or one supplier to another supplier, it is still the responsibility of the manufacturer to know where that equipment, whether it's commercial, whether it's defense, is being used. So that's, and the penalties for ITAR is quite significant in terms of money.